you're somebody who has influence over the cost of living, the energy market, or the rates of inflation, or some ability to change tax, if you can do some of these things in our economy, they're within your control. Exercise your power, your influence, godly character to try and bring around changes which promote, change and good, right? If you're listening to that and that's within your control, get on it. But for those of us that are not in control of those things, what is it that we are in control of? We might not have been given 10 minors, might not have been given 5, maybe we've been given 1. Whatever it is, that is our responsibility in this current moment. Don't panic about things which are beyond your control. Pray to the one who does control them. Ask him to do things to intervene, the sovereign Lord.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. I'm Dennis Allen. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus' words, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and they steal things, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves don't break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So, is it really possible to be a capitalist? Is it really possible in this culture to be a capitalist and a Christian? That's a conversation we want to have today with the 3 men who are joining us today on the Disciple Dilemma. Everyone is probably familiar, if you watched any of our podcasts, with Dr. Raymond Monroe. Dr. Raymond Monroe co-hosts with us. He asks really deep questions. My job's to keep the intellectual temperature way down. Raymond, we're really thrilled that you're here with us today.
Thank you, Dennis. Always fun to be here. Looking forward to talking to Andy and Marcos.
And another guest who's with us today is Marko Romanjek from Zagreb, Croatia. Marko, so glad to have you.
Thank you for hosting me.
It's really weird having somebody actually with you right here, and you can look at them in the real live world, right, instead of the digital. And Marko's world is going to be interesting as our conversation goes on today, because Marko is not only an engineer, not only an MBA, but he's also a young man who is in a startup venture mode, sort of in the angel capital investment world today. We'll talk a little bit about that. So we're so thrilled Marko could join us today. The real centerpiece, the guy the crosshairs are on today, is a wonderful guy, Andy Moore, Managing Director of Chorus Network. This is a platform where professional investors, in other words, people who are informed and understand the risks they're getting into, can go after competitive returns in the marketplace in an interesting niche that's labeled impact investing. We really want to unpack that. We want to think about that. Andy leads a team of really seasoned investment bankers. He's worked with family office managers, private equity advisors. This is old school for Andy, but it's his turf. It's the place Christ has called him to in one area of his life. Now, that's not the only side to Andy. His rap sheet's got another identity to it as well. You can find Andy speaking in a lot of places. He's an adjunct speaker with the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He is a very experienced evangelist. He's led business missions into some really hostile territory, into some really exciting and intimidating territory, invited to speak at some of the world's largest corporations, places like Facebook, UBS, Goldman Sachs, KPMG, Barclays. He is, Andy, a chartered accountant in England and in Wales. He has certificates from the Christian apologetics arena at the ACA, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He has theological and pastoral studies under his belt from Oxford University. He has a master's in philosophy also from the University of Birmingham. And along with this, of course, you have Andy's financial career. He started at KPMG, which is a really hotshot organization if you want to think about being involved in the financial marketplace. He's done a lot of advisory work with companies, and he's done work with groups like ADF International, Liberty Global, and Talentum before he joined Chorus. Third piece of his rap sheet, he's played rugby at the representative level. This is really amazing, in Ireland. Now that's some status and some stature. And most importantly, Andy is married to Rachel, who really helps round off Andy's edges. Andy, we're so glad you're with us today.
Oh, Dennis, that is the most detailed and elaborate and kind introduction I've ever heard. Many thanks. I only hope I can live up to be sort of half the guy that Andy Moore sounds like he is. But thank you for inviting me on today. What a pleasure.
My first question is, having played rugby, how much brain damage did occurred and how has that affected your career?
Well, I think different people would give different answers to that question. I tell you what, my wife would say I've got the worst memory she's ever come across. So arguably quite a bit, Raymond.
Tell us about the Chorus network and how that balance is having an impact with getting a good rate of return.
Yeah, we're glad to do so. So Chorus Network is, well, the most basic way to understand it is a corporate finance company whereby what we try to do is offer to a group of private investors that journey with us opportunities to invest in early stage businesses that have as part of their profitable business models positive social or environmental outcomes. You know, from the investor's perspective, what we've recognized that there is this growing and already large desire for people to put their capital into things that are having good outcomes for the world. But there has been a problem whereby the pipeline of deals, the opportunities are low quality. You might have come across the phrase greenwashing, where environmental credentials are bigged up to be something they're not. And so we want to get into that space and try and help the deal process and be a little bit more smooth, where the investor is getting a higher quality flow of opportunities and, you know, coaching the business on the other hand to maximize their kind of investable status, putting those two things together. So that's the Chorus Network, chorusnetwork.co.uk. We're based out of London. It's probably worth mentioning that we are paired with a venture capital fund called Opto Impact Ventures, where we have a capital raise going on for a given business. The fund that we control will probably look to do about 50% of that round, and we'll syndicate it with the angels that journey with Chorus. The source of our deals is an accelerator called Impact Central. So we put these three businesses together really to create what we refer to as an ecosystem, which if all three of those things are doing their job, the accelerator, the angel network, the fund, then you've got some serious momentum being added into this impact investment space. You mentioned ESG, so let me tell you why impact investing is different and better than ESG. You know, we're here today to talk about the integration of kind of theology and morality and Christianity and faith with how we understand the economy. So if I phrase it in those moral terms, how I think we can understand ESG is basically the realization that business needs to stop doing bad stuff. So maybe in the past 15 years, we've all thought, well, what's our pension fund invested in? What are those businesses doing? Let's take it away from that so that we prevent further harm being done. That's ESG, and great, we celebrate that. But actually, there's a moral Rubicon to cross where instead of not doing bad stuff, we actively pursue the good. So that's what I would define as impact investing. And it goes further, it takes more risk. It's got kind of more sophistication around it, in my opinion. But it's, you know, as somebody who's really kind of interested in this space, it's quite important for me to contend for that differential between impact and ESG.
How do you evaluate the impact of a company to really make it fit your paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, so you'll come across various kind of objective frameworks that exist out there, things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and other very clever frameworks that exist. And those are sort of, I would say, milestones in the map or different points of reference when you're thinking about it for yourself. But we tend to just want to get into the details of the particular company and ask ourselves, what is this company and the impact that it is claiming to have? And what would be a sensible way to measure that? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? Is it a combination of the two? And so that makes it measurable. And then from our point of view, whether or not it's investable is whether the impact is scalable. So to give you a couple of examples, you know, some of the impacts are more easy to measure than others. We work with a business here in Oxford in the UK, one of the UK's leading coffee roasteries. It sells specialty coffee to independent cafes all across the country. Really, really top stuff. It was nominated for Roaster of the Year at London Coffee Festival, which is probably the Europeans' leading kind of industry coffee thing. So that's a really great credential. But what it does is offer training and development opportunities to ex-offenders and people trying to rebuild their lives after they've had a period in prison. So seems like a good impact, and some really, really easy ways to measure that, because you can point to the people, James, Deborah, you know, Sandra, whoever it is, and say, these are the people whose lives are better as a result of what this business does, rather than having to get stuck into some of the complexities around KPIs and environmental metrics that nobody really knew existed, and they're very ethereal. You can, of course, go further, then you can start to say, well, what are some of the, augmented impacts? So if James's life is transformed and James avoids going back to prison, what does that save the taxpayer in terms of having to pay for his time in prison, and, all the kind of augmented things. So in my view, we just have to go on the basis of what the specific business is claiming and actually do some thinking, and then point it to different objective frameworks out there when we try to communicate that with others.
Seems to me that's sort of the paradigm that you're after, is a business that is creating enough value to be profitable, but also finding a way to be generous with their resources to have an impact.
Yeah, and there's a really important reason why we're going down the commercial road here, right? So there's plenty of charities and philanthropic options to achieve these sorts of things. And maybe historically, as Christians engaged with business, we've thought, well, the pursuit of profit is justified to the extent that we might give away those profits and do something really nice with those. And of course, there's a need for charity. There will be certain things that the economy can never solve for outside of sheer generosity. But actually, the time has really come for business to play its part in solving some of these problems and not outsourcing it to the charities and people who are prepared to work for less than if they were in the commercial world. And the one reason I like to tie it in with the pursuit of profit within a business model that is solving this is basically, if you take the example of something really easy to understand, like, Coca-Cola, right? Everyone knows Coca-Cola. We understand the brand, but it's actually one of the biggest polluters for plastics in the ocean. Just think of how many Coca-Cola bottles there are floating around the ocean right now. And Coca-Cola is often lauded for being so generous as to give away 1% of its profits to solve these problems that it's creating. Very, very good. But then if you kind of back solve a little bit further and you think to yourself, well, what was the operating profit margin that Coca-Cola is actually generating? Well, it's 15%. And the problem is actually proportional not to its profit or how much the profit is given away, but the revenue. So actually, we're creating a problem which is proportional to the sales of Coca-Cola, not 1% of the 15% of the revenue. So the philanthropic model will just never get there. We need to redesign these business models to actually contain the solutions inherently. And so that's why I'm so excited about the businesses that we work with here.
One of the challenges with Dennis's setup that Jesus says you can't love God and money, and where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Jesus also says that if you're the poor schmuck that got one talent and you didn't do anything with it, I'm a hard man. I expect you to make a profit. So Jesus is pretty clear. He expects us to be fruitful, not just in the area of churchy stuff, but in every area of our life. So it seems to me one of our biggest challenges, and as a technical guy in manufacturing, we don't appreciate the ordinary callings that people have. If I'm a brain surgeon, you think I'm a Christian, but if I'm a plumber, you don't think I'm a Christian when I unclog your toilet. Well, that's crazy. Everything we do glorifies God. Everything we're supposed to do. God put us in a garden, not in a church. So it seems to me with what you're doing, it's really fundamentally important to reach out to people in their core business and talk to them about what it means to be a Christian disciple within the financial world. What do you think it means to be a Christian disciple within the financial world?
Well, you've teed me up very nicely there to add a caveat to what you said about, that pursuit of profit and creation of more talents out of the talents that have been given to us, which is, the parallel for that parable is the parable of the 10 minas, which is told in Luke 19. And the workers there are given their minas, and then the king says, engage in business until I come. Then the king returns and overthrows all the resistance that had been set up, while he was away. And there's obviously the assessment of what has been achieved with the miners. And the question is, how much has been gained? Now, the interesting thing about the Greek in that phrase is that it's referring not so much the gain in terms of value output, but more so gains in terms of volume input or output. So rather, with the whole question about the existence of these workers while the king was away, was whether or not they would act in line with the king's wishes, reflect his character, usher in his kingdom in the sure knowledge that he will return. It becomes this question of volume. How many times were you prepared to put your head above the parapet? How many times were you willing to be known as somebody who served this king, wanted this king to be king, even though he's not here? And there are all sorts of debates about whether or not Jesus should be king. So we can sometimes get into a problematic conversation where somebody who might not be successful in business and for some reason, whether to do with themselves or something outside of themselves, doesn't produce loads in terms of value from the minors or talents they were given, and somehow can mistranslate that into some kind of failure of discipleship or something that went wrong in their lives. Christ is not coming back to us to work out how well we were as business people or capitalists. It's more so, how much did you proclaim my name while you were doing what you were doing? So that then turns into the advice that you might offer to people in the business world, which would be firstly to, apprehend the bookends of your existence. You live in a space in time where the king has been, he's ascended into heaven for the time being, but he will return. So understand absolutely everything in terms of this linear progression of history. The redemption that is going on started at the resurrection and will be brought to completion when the kingdom of heaven is inaugurated, and accept the invitation to be part of it. That is the place where it all begins. In terms of advice to how to participate in the business world as a Christian.
As I think about this paradigm that you set up, Andy, you and some of your colleagues over in Oxford, we were just on not long ago with a chap named Simon Edwards, which someone Andy knows very well. And we posed this question to him. We're hoping, Andy, that you'll really be able to knock the ball out of the park, because Simon was a little nice about this. But we know you as a capitalist, you will just wade into this thing with the cruelty and force of the market. If we really present Chorus with the problem of, is it going to be impact in the fuller definition you just gave us, or the survival of the company at the bottom line, who wins? Which way does this go, Andy? Tell us how all you guys are going to think about this little Gordian knot.
Well, the first answer is really straightforward, Dennis. The context that we live in now, the trends of the consumers and what people want from their brands and the products they support. They just won't buy your product if you've got a sloppy ethical background, or your supply chain is awful, or you can point to all sorts of terrible things that you're polluting or doing in the environment. Thankfully, the economy has come along where we're seeing more and more people rejecting those types of products. So I don't see in the longest of runs, and this is something we would see as being true if Christianity is true, that there is a redemption of what's happening around us, sometimes harder to see and easier to see, that people don't want your stuff. You won't make profit unless you sort some of these things out, right? Now, I think the talk, or the kind of thing that you're talking to there, is this idea of profit being king. And if you had teed me up with that, I would have said, well, profit never has been king. Cash is king. So there's obviously some kind of misunderstanding there. But let's continue on with the idea that profit might be king. Well, it's not really, is it? Because why do businesses want to make profit? Why do we want to be successful? Well, maybe it's because we want to get rich, but we don't want to get rich as an end in itself either, do we? These things are always paired on to some other utility, some other thing that we think that being rich might allow us to have, a lifestyle of some kind of description, a type of car that we want to drive, whatever. Profit never really has been king. It's always been a means to the other things that we wanted to achieve. Now, whenever you look at the history of literature and different things that thinkers have said about this in philosophy over the years, one of the most interesting people is the Greek philosopher Aristotle, famous for all sorts of big things that he wrote, the book Nicomachean Ethics, thousands and thousands of pages long. But on the very first page, he raises this question of purpose. Why is it that we do the things that we do? So let's insert, why is it that we run a business to maximize profit? Well, he would say, you've got to essentially play the why game with yourself. What is it that lies behind the profit that you think it's going to unlock? Thing X makes thing Y possible. And when you have Y, then suddenly Z comes into the equation. But he says all of that reasoning has to end at some point or another. There has to be something in the universe which is not worth pursuing because it releases something else, but it's worth pursuing because of what it is in and of itself. So if we're going to say, why should a business make profit? Why should anybody do anything ever in life? The whole point of these questions is to lead us to the thing that we think might be worth pursuing in and of itself. In other words, there is nothing beyond it. Now, Aristotle didn't really have that good an answer to that question, but I tell you who did: Jesus Christ. You'll know that he says in the Sermon on the Mount, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all the rest is going to take care of itself. He talks about food, he talks about clothing, he talks about our day-to-day economic concerns, but he says all of that's going to kind of fit into context whenever you put me as king in your life and you pursue my righteousness, which tells me that the pursuit of all of these things is some kind of virtue, the righteousness of God, the relationship with God, which has got to be right at the top of all of our pursuits of everything. And suddenly the rest, the pursuit of profit in business or otherwise, will start to feel a little bit more comfortable.
Now, okay, guys, I like this. This is nice. It feels good. It feels comfortable. It feels religious. But what I'm really kind of thinking is, Andy, KPMG, come on, man. I mean, those guys, they're after the buck. You were talking about a talk that you've given. I've listened to you guys talk about this before. If profit is king, why do I need ethics? At the end of the day, Andy, you've been running in circles in the early part of your life with a lot of financial sharks. It's been a capitalistic, defining that as money is king environment. What was that like for you as a believer in those kind of waters?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. These people often get painted as, this kind of Gordon Gekko caricatures, So I was in London, Canary Wharf, which, if you've not heard of Canary Wharf, is kind of our version of Wall Street. And London is the financial capital of the world. We're in the bang center of all the time zones, more transactions done through London than anywhere else. And yet it's just full of normal people. They might work in that context and they might have some of these desires and they'll work late. But if you're working late, as we often did, you can only really talk about how many cars you're going to buy or all of these materialistic pursuits up until a certain point. And then, like everyone else, your questions about life and meaning, morality, destiny, purpose will just resurface. That was what my experience was. These business people who we like to put in these Gordon Gekko caricatures are just normal people with the same questions as the man in the street, the teacher in the school, the fireman in the burning blaze. There's a certain unifying factor which isn't difficult to find. And if you'd also worked there, Dennis, you'd have experienced the same thing as I did. And I know that you'll have experience from all of the different business contexts that you've been part of. It doesn't take very long to just understand what are the common denominator human experience questions to do with longing. And I've got all sorts of examples of how those types of things used to come up in my workplace context with KPMG, as you mentioned. I could tell a couple of stories. But all of that actually then became the platform to my ministry. And as you've mentioned, the Festival of Thought and the various ways that we were able to connect good news from the gospel to these questions that emerge, during our working careers.
You're taking the Festival of Thought into these places that most Christians would say, I would never have a chance to be a voice, connect, and talk. What kind of questions did you get from these people who were living at the pinnacle at Canary Wharf? What were you hearing?
So I'll tell you the question that it all started with, actually. And we need to go back in our minds to kind of 2009-10, where we're just coming off the back of the financial crisis and the failure of lots of our financial institutions and the general suspicion that if you worked in banking, you were a terrible person. And so the firm I was with, KPMG, adopted a new strapline. Above all, we act with integrity. This was put behind the reception in our building and put up in all the billboards and all the elevators. Above all, we act with integrity. Wonderful. So I'm a Christian. I'm thinking, boom, back of the net. This is so great. I'm so pleased I work for an organization that wants that to be its strapline and what it's known for. But you turn around and you say, well, what is integrity? How do I know whether I am a person of integrity? And more so, what happens when integrity fails? Because do you know what I did last night when no one was looking to that spreadsheet? I just made it work in my favor. So it's not a question of if, but when integrity fails. And so we started to think about this as a group of Christians in KPMG, and we put on a couple of events to try and add some substance to the language that we were seeing everywhere. Therefore, as a group of Christians, we experienced being a blessing to our colleagues and helping them in a question which together we understood as being very, very important, contributing to the flourishing of our organization. And lo and behold, the Christian worldview's got loads of amazingly beautiful, transformative things to say about that question of integrity. But it goes further, questions of purpose that we've already talked about, questions of how to do different things with our wealth, how should we manage our success. These were the types of questions that would come up at the Festival of Thought.
You have a young man who's looking at you and saying, look, I'm just about to enter university. I'm really thinking about my strengths are in the area of finance and accounting and business. Andy, what advice do you give to the young believer as they begin their journey forward, to begin framing a worldview that functions well in there, not simply survives, not simply succeeds in the human sense, but what do you want to do to coach this person and encourage them? Can they do it, or should they run from it? How do they do it if you do tell them to do it?
I really like the phrase you used there, worldview, Dennis. That's a brilliant word to bring in here, which is that, to understand what Christianity is, it's not something that we kind of have as a certain compartment in our world alongside other experiences like career or family. Christianity doesn't sit in a box that we open and close from time to time. It's actually a lens through which we view absolutely everything. And the claim is that Christianity is the best explanation of all reality. Christianity is the best way to make sense of our experiences. And Christianity is the thing that brings us flourishing and a sense of emotional fulfillment and all of those kind of human elements of our experience. So the biggest piece of advice, and actually this is advice that I would have given to myself at the age of 19 when I became a Christian, was to understand how big Christianity is, how much room there is to explore within that, and therefore how much freedom to pursue these giftings in the area of finance. The example that you've given me, somebody off to university to perfect their skills in that area. Beautiful, go for it. Christianity is big enough for you to pursue that as far as you want, and to know that that is part of what you can do to contribute to this redemption in the world that God is committed to, and to believe that there is no question that will come up in your studies or in your experience that will derail you. We are not talking about Christianity as being only a set of intellectual commitments, which if you hear something which is difficult to understand, it might, mean that your whole faith is invalid. Christianity talks rather about a change of identity, being born again. And so whilst our intellectual development is part of our discipleship, it means that we can take all of our questions to the Lord and to pray and to seek wisdom and to read books, and over time to understand how all of these pieces fit in together. So to not be intimidated by questions, I would say. There's two big pieces of advice. Go for it, feel free, and accept that questions and doubt are part of the journey. That's how we learn, and to understand it as the development of a worldview.
That's great. One of the things you said about your early experience where they said, we're going to operate with integrity, and you started asking, what does it mean to operate with integrity? I worked for General Motors for a while, and of course they were trying to teach us that if you wanted to be successful, you needed to be kind to people, you need to have integrity. And it seemed to me pretty clearly that a lot of the management training was trying to say, if you have integrity, you'll be successful, which I always thought was upside down, because you don't get integrity to be successful. God blesses you because you have integrity. So one of the things I would ask you is, don't you think you would be talking to those young people and saying, God will take care of you if you act with righteousness, with integrity, even in difficult times, instead of saying that, if you want to be successful, integrity is the way to get there.
You're making me think of a quote by Mark Twain. Now, hopefully I don't mess this up, but he said, the secret of success is sincerity, or let's call it integrity. Once you've learned to fake that, you've got it made.
Sincerity means without wax, and it comes from the casting industry, where we used to cover the holes up in the casting with candle wax when we were making brass and bronze castings. So sincerity means without wax, covering up your defects.
All right. Well, that's something I've learned. Yeah. Well, so supposing that what your question is getting at, if there's a certain utility to sincerity or integrity, because it might help us to get on in the business world and customers might appreciate it, does that somehow invalidate the pursuit of integrity? Well, this is where I think joining up the dots, so we tend to sort of like define integrity in a very limited way, which is, living out consistently certain values that we espouse, right? But that is not a wide enough definition of integrity, because we also need that integrity to exist in our own hearts. It has to be a reflection of what's really going on in there, because if we have something else going on in there and we're living by a different set of values, obviously that's the first place that integrity is broken down. But I would want to say that there's a need for a third part of the equation, which is spoken far less of, and where we as Christians have got something to add, which is the mapping up, not of what's just what's going on in our own hearts with how we behave in the world, because we could have that definition of integrity and produce all sorts of terrible outcomes. Let's say, for example, I had some moral values that you disagreed with. Let's say everyone disagreed with them, but I lived them out consistently. That's integrity, but it's not leading to anything which is true and good and beautiful as a result. So I would want to say, let's have those three things working in a row. What's in your heart, how you're behaving, and then the piece that nobody really bothers to do, and this is what it really makes a difference, is whether the outcomes of your behavior are leading to goodness and truth and beauty in the world. Those are words that Plato used, but I quite like them. And so mapping them up to the things which are really worth pursuing in and of themselves, as Aristotle would say, or as Christians we would substitute in there, are they reflective of the kingdom of God and his righteousness?
Folks, we are talking with Andy Moore, the Managing Director of Chorus Networks UK, along with our friend Marco Romagna from Zagreb, Croatia, a startup entrepreneur. And we are grateful that you would tune into this broadcast talking about capitalism, culture, and Christianity. Are they compatible? We'll be right back. Folks, welcome back to The Disciple Dilemma. We're talking with Andy Moore, Managing Director of the Chorus Network UK, an impact investing organization that tries to make the difference not only on the bottom line, but also in the society and the culture.
Yeah, as an older person who still struggles with trying to be the person I ought to be, those three things are really helpful to think about, because for a long time, it's relatively easy midlife to realize you're supposed to be kind. And so pick out things you can do to be kind. But it doesn't mean that you in your heart are kind. You don't have kind feelings. You just do kind acts. And so I think one of the biggest challenges we face as we get older is to really begin to grapple in prayer with God and the Holy Spirit to change who we are, so that kindness is not just something I do, but some person that I'm becoming.
Marco, you are a disciple of Christ in the world of startup entrepreneurship in Zagreb, Croatia, a beautiful city. What kind of pressures and pushing are you feeling as an entrepreneur as you have to talk to potential investors and potential networks that get you to investors? What kind of pressures do you feel as a Christian in that arena?
Well, definitely what Andy said, the question of integrity is there, because I don't know how it's in the States or in the UK, but Croatia, Mediterranean country, it's southern. It is a little bit looser, and people like to go and ski around the rules, and everything is fluid and flexible until it isn't. And that is probably the biggest issue. I, as a Christian entrepreneur who is trying to be salt and light, face, not to give someone bribery, black money, follow the rules, and walk the talk also. Sometimes it is easier to promise something, to say something, and you will be maybe one step or two steps ahead. And I know that it isn't like that still. And, not to promise something we still are not, and we never might be. So question of integrity, and I would also add obeying the authorities.
One of the challenges that I see in the US, and I think in the UK too, and historically, because we had such a strong Christian culture, we thought that we could have a handshake with anybody and believe that they would fulfill their commitments. But in historical societies like Croatia, you always operated within a network of people that you trusted to have integrity and to keep their word. And I'm assuming, but it's sort of a question, that that's still true in Croatia, that it's not just the rules and the authority and the law. The basic way of becoming successful at being effective is to find people that you can collaborate with that are honest and keep their word and care about you.
There are two things that I would add, and then want to throw it back to Marco to hear what he would say. But just on what Marco's first point was there of the sort of complexity, and could I use the word messiness of doing business in this world in this time? And this is, when it comes to the question of integrity, what is the unique, beautiful thing that the message of Christianity has got to offer, which is the possibility of forgiveness, the possibility of transformation, the possibility of being put back on the right path if you have fallen off it for whatever reason. That is so important to bear in mind, because we will fail with integrity. So people watching this podcast, listening to it, thinking of the email that they sent last night, or the decision they've taken, or even maybe they are somebody who's feeling that, I'm not keeping up my side of the bargain here, and there's all sorts of pressures, situations that they didn't expect to find themselves in. Take it to the Lord, take it to him, ask for his intervention, experience his forgiveness. That is the thing that Christianity says about integrity, and when it fails, how we can keep going with our lives. And that's so important to remember. But then to this other kind of wider, like, structural issue about the place of integrity in our culture, and how, in certain places we operate with, circles of people we trust, like you mentioned, Raymond, like people, like a little defined place where we know some form of morality has to prevail in order for us to operate. If it was Italy, we'd say it was the mafia. It's how far out does that circle extend? And ultimately, what we've got to say is that for there to be hope in an economy in the long run, is that virtue and integrity needs to be upheld and contended for. So nobody uses cash anymore. But if I was to get my wallet out and look at what it says on my £10 note, it would say something to the effect of, I promise to pay the bearer on demand £10 of gold. So credit, think of the place of credit in the economy, is Latin credere, to believe. We have to trust each other at some level. And so whilst we know that there are all of these failures going on and contracts being broken and all of this mess, we can't start abandoning the possibility, and we need to continue to act in good faith and to have that propensity to trust so far as we can. Otherwise, we get into much more wider difficulties for the economy. So that's enough, Marco. I knew you had more to say.
No, I was enjoying listening to you, actually. But back to your question, Raymond. Yeah, I think you got it right. I think in Croatia, and because we are a smaller country, and we are still a family and relatives oriented society, it is easier doing business with people and making connections based on I would say social networks and connections you have due to your family status and maybe friends, acquaintance, and so on. But at the other hand, it is also a challenge to obey the authorities then, because as you mentioned, then you easily become a mafia then. You easily become your own society with your own rules. And I think the character of a person, which includes integrity, of course, is the number one trait we should and we pursue when we are looking for associates and co-workers in our team and the partners, because if you don't have a character, then nothing else matters.
How do we raise up a culture of believers who are resilient in the pressures you faced, in the disappointments of friends who have let you down, and in the pressures of the businesses that you live in? How do we help leaders think to shape the cultures that young believers rising up should live in? Raymond, your ball.
Two cores of leadership are both about the team and the task, the goal and the group you're involved with. And so it seems to me that the leaders need to deeply make friends within the community, the faith community that they're in, and with those friends help solve problems together. And I think if they work together that way, they will develop the resilience, not only out of their own personal experience, but in having a community that has the expectations that they're going to act with integrity and that they're really going to make a difference because they're loved and cared for, and they've seen coworkers come alongside them and do things. So I think really building that community is the key to leadership. And you do that by making friends and helping those friends solve their problems.
Thank you. Marco, your ball.
I agree with what Raymond said. And I would just like to add on one C.S. Lewis quote. I think it's from Mere Christianity, where he says, don't add up to Christ anything. If you are a Christian and you're lost. And I think this is one of the main messages that the leaders should proclaim to the young folks, like we all are.
Thank you.
And to show them by example and to teach them who Christ is and what it means to pursue the kingdom of God above anything else, and to have a faith and a belief that Lord will add up everything else. So I would add this to the friendship and example that Raymond mentioned.
Great.
Andy, you face these pressures. You have lived through some pretty shocking disappointments. How are you going to coach some leaders to get people in a better position to run the race in Christ in this world?
Well, I mean, it's an unbelievably difficult, complex question, Dennis. You know, I'm sitting here in the UK where Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has just passed away. And right now, the queue to go and pay respects to her as her coffin lies in Westminster Abbey, it's got about a 14-hour waiting time. There are people flying in from all across the world to join a queue to walk past her coffin. What is the one thing that people say about her style of leadership? It's that it was a servant leadership, and that her place in this constitutional monarchy that we have here as the monarch was not one of rule and reign, but one of service. Now, that's something which is said a lot about the Christian model of leadership, but we sort of still don't get it, right? Like we think, you know, the leader is the most competent person in the room, the most powerful, the most charismatic. And especially in the West, those are the things that we want to extol and think that set us apart as leaders. We must have a right to lead because we are the most qualified, we have the degree or whatever. That is not true. It's basically just not true. Character is what precedes competence in terms of Christian leadership. And I think we need to focus on that character before we propose to lead anyone. And you mentioned, you know, some of the failures of leadership that I've seen around, and it's where that basic character and accountability was lost or not valued, and that truth was being kept in dark places, and things, appearances and competence were being put above truth, reality, and character. And you see all sorts of precedent for this in scripture about who are the people recognized as leaders or celebrated as leaders. And the one which has kind of like immediately sprung to mind, where you see all of this coming together, you have these different people, in the story of Genesis, where you have the kingdom of God started off when God calls Abraham out to leave what he's known and to venture into the unknown. And then we have Isaac, and then the kingdom and its leadership passes to Jacob, and it's all going okay with a few ups and downs. But then you have this proliferation of candidates of who is going to continue on that line of leadership towards this kingdom growth. 12 sons of Jacob. And the one that everyone points to and thinks, well, he's the superstar of Genesis and the leader of the kingdom is Joseph, who goes down to Egypt and reaches the top of that empire, the top of the organization, we would say, an amazingly gifted administrator, full of competence, and was able to provide for a whole nation. And, all of these wonderful things that really we should just think Joseph is such an amazing leader. But actually, if you read Genesis really carefully, he is the one that's actually mummified, buried in Egypt, and not with his fathers. And his name is not recognized as the tribe of Israel after that. Who is the one that actually is anointed, from whom the scepter will not depart? It is actually Judah, the one who made mistakes, who recognized the error of his ways, was willing to serve his brothers by saying, I'll be the one that takes the rap if we don't bring Benjamin back to you, when he did that deal with Joseph when he was still keeping his identity unknown. Nor was it Reuben, who was the eldest and who would have said, well, I've got the degree or whatever. It was this person who reflected on their character, took that to the Lord, and the Lord then gave him good works and things that he is called to do. So if there's anyone listening to this who thinks of themselves as a leader, and I think of myself as a leader, but I want to think of myself, well, what is it that is the basis of my thinking that I'm a leader? Is it because I think I'm really competent and gifted and communicator and intelligent? Because all of that stuff is subservient to what's happening in your heart. And you're not qualified to lead anything until you've got a character which is under the direction of the Lord.
Okay, guys. So 3 of you now have to respond to the following setup. And of course, as Raymond will tell you, I only set up the fairest of questions with the most reasonable context. And if you look at the instrument panel on the political front, it is chaos in the US, despair in the UK, the Queen's passing, Andy's mentioned that, and no small level anxiety in Croatia as we stare at what's Serbia going to do, what the heck are the Russians going to do, where's this going? Of course, we've got the conflict in Ukraine. We've got the disaster in Afghanistan right now. Let's come up with something more rosy to talk about. Oh, I know. Let's go to the markets. Well, it's all red lights there today. If you take a look at the stock markets, whether you're trying to walk through the DAX or the FTSE, you're looking at the Dow, you're looking at Standard & Poor's, it's all red lights. It's all pointing downhill. Volumes roughly holding steady, but values dropping out right now. If you try to go to the crypto side of things, we're sub 20,000 now and have been for some time.
Yeah, the complexity of life is sometimes so surprising for us, but complexity of market and the politics sometimes is even more surprising. And I don't think that we as Christians should be the leaders in despair or should despair at all. My opinion on the current situation is that we as believers are called to be shrewd and wise, and one of characteristics of shrewdness is to put ourselves in the context. And God is above, He is a sovereign. As far as we proclaim that, we should live like that. And yeah, it is hard, I admit, but we cannot despair.
Actually, as you know, I'm deeply pessimistic about the financial side, that we've taken all the guardrails off, that we pump so much money in the market, that all the equities and financial instruments are overvalued by a factor of 2 or 3 compared to historically. I think Andy may be able to find opportunities within that space in individual companies, but I think that's parts of disaster. But I don't think we have to panic at all. one of the things that really is helpful to me is to understand that Jesus says the parables are the narrative structure that lets you understand his teaching and his acts in the Gospels. And the parable of the sower says that there are some seeds that fall in the weeds and start to grow up, and they get choked out by the thorns, which are concerned about riches and concerns about the cares of this world. The two things that you raise as things we're supposed to be concerned about. And it indicates that if we're good soil and we live according to the word, the way Andy's talking about, that we will actually be fruitful no matter what happens. So it seems to me that that's really a call to integrity in terms of our Christianity.
Andy, if headlines are king, if circumstances are king, surely fear should be our idol and our God. Where are we in this thing as a disciple? Come on.
Yeah, I'm just going to go out after this and just run around screaming and share panic and tell everybody the world is about to end. Listen, I guess there are different categories of people listening to this, right? So if you're somebody who has influence over the cost of living, the energy market, or the rates of inflation, or some ability to change tax, if you can do some of these things in our economy, they're within your control. Exercise your power, your influence, godly character to try and bring around changes which promote, change and good, right? If you're listening to that and that's within your control, get on it. But for those of us that are not in control of those things, what is it that we are in control of? We might not have been given 10 minors, might not have been given 5, maybe we've been given 1. Whatever it is, that is our responsibility in this current moment. Don't panic about things which are beyond your control. Pray to the one who does control them. Ask him to do things to intervene, the sovereign Lord. But this is where I think it's really important to pay attention to, what a Croatian has to say about this. And you Americans, listen up. When I watch your kind of political debates, your economic conversations, Christianity often gets rolled up in there as if to take this political view or this economic stance is what it means to be a Christian. Well, we know that's not the case. And there's this need for perspective, which is what Marco was put on the agenda in this conversation, where he's pointed to the change of time over history. And things are difficult in Croatia at the moment, but they were worse 30 years ago. And, here in the UK, we're alarmed by rates of people attending church going down, or the understanding of Christianity in the culture reducing, or even among those who profess Christianity to not assent to some of the classic doctrinal positions that we thought went with the basic confession of faith. All of those things are true. But actually, it was worse in history as well. So the thing that we always point to here in the UK is the Victorian times, as if these were some kind of wonderful, panacea of Christianity's influence in the culture and the Industrial Revolution and how quickly everything grew. But actually, one of the most influential people, and I know that you quote Wilberforce in your book, Dennis, William Wilberforce, who we know had that great calling to, the abolition of the slave trade, but he actually said that God had put 2 great missions on his heart: the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. And so this sense of panic, or the reformation of manners, we understand the restoration of morality or Christianity in the culture. Christians have been panicking about their generation for as long as Christians have been around, right? This is not new. And so we need to mourn the times, but exchange that spirit of despair for the garment of praise that Scripture offers us. And to, above all, remember, and kind of what we've said already in this podcast, the bookends of our existence. We are framed in a time whereby we are living in the hope of Christ's return. The future is not going to be a future that we construct by our clever capital markets and whatever we do with our economic systems. The future will be brought to us. And so we're participating in this ambiguity, but to remember all of the perspective and that is on offer, whether we look into human history or to a Christian understanding of the future. So let's not panic. Let's just keep that godly perspective.
What a terrific wrap up. Folks, we have been talking with Andy Moore, Managing Director of Chorus Networks UK. The question on the table: culture, capitalism, and Christianity. Is that really compatible? Along with our time with Andy. We've been able to enjoy some time with Marko Romanjic, Zagreb, Croatia, young startup entrepreneur, and the guy who always untangles my messes, Dr. Raymond Monroe. Andy, thank you for being with us today.
True pleasure, gents. That time has absolutely flown. Thank you for such a stimulating conversation.
Marko, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Raymond, as always, thank you for your wisdom.
You're welcome. And Marko, Andy, it was great to meet you virtually. Hope to meet you in person sometimes. And it was really a fun conversation. You've got real insights and commitments to Christ. So it's just a delight. Thank you.
Folks, we've been talking about this idea of culture, capitalism, and Christianity. And the point that we're trying to make is, as disciples, we live with a certain hope that Jesus was raised from the dead. That is not hope in the sense of I wish or I'm dreaming. It is the certainty. That's what the word means, certainty. And it is the certainty that Christ was raised. And if he was raised, the game has changed. Christianity, discipleship significantly in the American world has been hacked. We've been trying to make that point in so many forums and conversations, and I think we've heard that today. Help us get the word out in the digital marketplace. It's a crowded place. We're putting up a screen right now so you can see how to see some of the conversations like these that we've had. We've had Andy on today. We had Oz Guinness on a couple of days ago. Justin Gravitz, Navigators, a few days before that, talking about these same issues. Follow us, please. Help us get leverage in the marketplace with Facebook. We're at The Disciple Dilemma. At the YouTube side, we're The Disciple Dilemma. If you go to Instagram, The Disciple Dilemma. Rumbly, The Disciple Dilemma. Help us help leaders change the culture of disciples being raised up in the communities of faith today. And as always, thanks for listening.